It began, as these things so often do, with something too small to matter and too quiet to be dismissed. A Thursday, rain-smeared and ink-blue, the sort of day that makes the Bodleian seem less a library than a refuge for the vaguely wounded. I'd finished a lecture, not mine, of course, but a visiting classicist's attempt to render Catullus in something dangerously close to Lancashire vowels. And, needing the antidote of silence and whiskey, I wandered across to the King's Arms. The place was half empty, as it always seems to be in the hour between the Don's second coffee and the student's first pint. There's a particular hush to Oxford pubs in the late afternoon, a hush shaped not by quietness, but by the soft clinking of expectation. I took my usual seat by the back, near the radiator that's never fully warm, but at least sympathetic. The crossword in the Times was already 2/3 done, as if the morning's occupant had run out of ink or interest. 9 across read, Wit's final gesture, 6, unsolved. Behind me, 2 older voices murmured with the frayed elegance of long association. I recognized one, Professor Malison, I believe, retired mathematician turned something of an eccentric fixture. The other voice was unfamiliar but had the crisp weariness of a man who'd once delighted in being understood and had since learned to prefer being misquoted. They spoke of a college dinner, something about a toast gone awry, a joke that had landed with the thud of poor timing and worse taste. Then came the line. Not loud, but perfectly audible. A misquoted Chaucer, and thus she made her unbocaled Al the same. Malison chuckled politely. The other did not correct the line, nor explain it. He only said softly, "You never knew, did you?" And then, "Not really," as though it mattered, as though it was the punchline to something only one of them had heard. They left soon after, their coats buttoned against a rain that had grown serious. I lingered a little longer. Half my pint gone, the crossword still staring, the clue still unanswered. Wit's final gesture. I thought of sarcasm, of irony, of satire, even of suicide. None fit. I moved on. It wasn't until I stood to leave that I noticed it. The coaster, one of those plain cardboard types usually curling at the edges. Someone had written on it in a neat, angular hand. Latin was never the problem, the laughter was. No name, no signature, no punchline, just that. I pocketed it without knowing why. An instinct, the sort of small unease that grows louder in memory than it ever was in the moment. I told myself it was nothing. Oxford is full of ghosts that only seem peculiar in hindsight. Outside, the rain had turned the cobbles to gunmetal. The dreaming spires dripped like exhausted thoughts. A bell sounded somewhere distant. St. Giles, perhaps. Or maybe just time passing more audibly than usual. Back in the flat, I poured another whiskey and stared out at the darkness. The line stuck with me. "You never knew, did you?" Spoken like someone who had waited far too long to be understood. Or forgiven. That night I dreamt of laughter. Not the warm kind, but the brittle sort you hear just before someone says something that changes everything. It echoed through a dining hall I didn't recognize, and at the far end of a long table, someone raised a glass and smiled without joy. By morning, I'd forgotten most of the dream. Only the smile remained. And the crossword still unsolved. I remember thinking at the time that it was nothing more than a discarded remark. A quip misplaced, a line fumbled, the kind of incident that Oxford digests and forgets. But memory, unlike Oxford, is poor at forgetting. And I would hear that line again, in a very different room, beside a very different glass. It would mean everything. Death, when it visits Oxford, tends to arrive politely, unhurried, unannounced, and more often than not in the form of a letter, a bell, or the absence of a sound one had grown accustomed to. In this case, it was the porter's call at 7:10, interrupting a breakfast I'd been attempting to dignify with marmalade and the Times. The voice was hesitant. They'd found a body in St. Fridswide's, an academic, a senior fellow. No signs of violence, but the college wanted discretion. I dislike that word. It suggests a stain one might gently lift from silk rather than something irrevocable. Still, the coffee was cooling. Lewis drove, he always does. The porter who met us, a man of 60 with a stoop that spoke of both service and suppressed irritation, led us through a series of quiet quadrangles until we reached the set of rooms. Dr. Miles Vesey, that was the name, lecturer in literature. Something of a recluse, but with a reputation for brilliant cruelty. A wit, they said, though the word landed oddly now, as if it were a misdiagnosis. His body was found in the study. Seated, one hand still resting on the arm of his chair, the other palm up beside a sherry glass. His head tilted slightly, as if mid-thought. There was a faint smile on his lips, the sort people wear when they've just corrected someone in Latin. On the desk in front of him lay a single card, cream-colored, thick stock. It read, in blocky, uneven type, "You never knew, did you?" I looked at the card longer than I meant to. There was no envelope, no signature, nothing on the reverse. Only that sentence. A phrase that rang not like a threat, but like the second half of something once whispered in a pub. A misremembered retort, perhaps. The kind of thing one says when the laughter's stopped and someone's still standing there trying to explain the joke. Lewis moved quietly through the room, noting the unopened post, the stack of marked essays, and a leather-bound edition of The Anatomy of Melancholy that seemed almost too on the nose. He asked if we should consider it suspicious. I said, "Not yet." It was the wrong kind of stillness. There were no pills, no sign of struggle. The glass wasn't broken, the window was slightly ajar, the room smelled faintly of lavender and old smoke. I opened the bottom drawer of the desk. Inside, a faded photograph of a college dining room, 20, maybe 30 years ago. 5 young men are seated at a high table. One of them, I thought, looked like a much younger Vesey. Another bore a passing resemblance to someone I'd seen in the papers. No names, only the notation in pencil on the back. The last real toast. A joke, no doubt, or meant to be. The college was quiet. It always is when someone dies. Respect, tradition, or simply fear of interruption. Hard to say. We interviewed a few fellows. Polite, contained. One of them, a philosopher with eyes like scratched glass, said Vesey had been working on a paper. Something about humor and hierarchy. Irony as domination. I asked whether it was a comedy or a confession. He didn't laugh. The medical examiner would later rule it a natural cause. Heart failure. Nothing unusual for a man of 70 who still smoked Gauloise and drank like it was still 1962. But the card remained. No fingerprints. No one admitted to sending it. We left just before noon. The sky had cleared. In the quad, pigeons pecked in silence. In the car, Lewis asked me what I thought it meant. "You never knew, did you?" I said, perhaps nothing, but I knew better. The joke hadn't landed. The audience, it seemed, had changed, and somewhere, someone was still laughing. St. Fridswide's is not a college that welcomes change, nor visitors, nor even the suggestion that the world beyond its cloisters continues to move forward. The stone is older than most memories, and the air carries that peculiar dampness of ancient paper, as if the building itself has spent centuries reading too closely. It is, I've always thought, a place designed not for learning, but for remembering, and forgetting selectively. Lewis and I returned just after midday, the sun now failing to dry the moss that clung to every step. The college porter, whose name I still hadn't asked, directed us with rehearsed indifference to the senior common room. Inside, 6 or 7 dons sat over coffee, and those small almond biscuits no one ever seems to eat, their voices low but pointed. Introductions were brief. The master, a small woman with severe hair and a voice honed by committees, expressed the college's condolences to itself. Dr. Miles Vasey had, by all accounts, been brilliant, difficult, and entirely of this place. A man who made enemies by accident and kept friends by neglect. A fixture, they said, like a creaking hinge. No one quite knew when he'd stopped being amusing, or when he started being feared. It's a curious thing, how a man can be present in so many minds, yet absent in every sentence. I listened to the way they avoided saying anything true. The classics fellow, Temple, recalled Vasey's notorious wit, though his eyes didn't smile. The economist, Hargrave, said Vasey once proved a point by refusing to speak for an entire term. No one asked what the point was. But it was Sarah Merrow who interested me most. Tall, deliberate, a lecturer in linguistics who had once published something startling on the semantics of confession. She seemed neither shocked nor saddened, but vaguely relieved, as though a piano string had finally stopped humming. She drank her coffee without sugar and corrected a colleague's pronunciation of sub rosa without looking up. Later, I found myself in her office. Books stacked in what might be considered either defiance or devotion. I asked her what she thought of Vasey. She paused before answering, said he had once been her supervisor a long time ago. Brilliant, yes, but not kind. He had, she said, an extraordinary gift for locating weakness. Not so much to fix it, but to hold it up like a specimen. She mentioned a visiting scholar from Prague, Thomas Vacek, who had spent several weeks working with Vasey the previous term. An odd man, apparently, fond of formal jokes and obscure references. He and Vasey had argued in Latin over the translation of a medieval poem. It had ended with Vasey laughing alone. She did not know why. The circle of suspects, if I were even allowed to call them that, was not wide but densely drawn. Men and women who had dined together for decades exchanged footnotes and favors and, in some cases, unfinished grievances. There was no outsider here, no jealous nephew or disgruntled spouse. If this was murder, and I still wasn't sure it was, then it was an intellectual one, committed not in rage, but in quiet, cultivated contempt. On the way out, I lingered near the high table plaque where the names of past masters were etched into oak. One stood out, Dr. Marianne Ridley, masters from 1963 to 1971, a rare female name among so many Johns and Edwards. I remembered her vaguely. Some controversy about her early retirement. I asked the porter later if she was still alive. He nodded, said she lived just outside the city, near Godstow. Rarely visited. Lewis asked me if we'd learned anything. I said, not yet, but a circle, once closed, is difficult to enter, or to escape. In the quad, the wind stirred old leaves into a slow, soundless spiral. I watched them until the porter locked the gate behind us, and even then I thought I heard laughter, just a thread of it. Frayed, almost forgotten. Some memories do not age. They wait, folded like old letters behind the mind's tidier corners. It was the scent that brought it back. Stale port, floor polish, and the faintest residue of mothballs. The combination clung to the hall at St. Fridewide's, particularly near the high table, where formality resided even in silence. The scout who'd let us in, elderly, wheezing, more careful than curious, told us the Dons had gathered here for dinner 3 nights earlier. The last night Vasey had been seen alive. I asked who'd sat nearest him. He hesitated, then nodded toward the far right of the table. There, he said, where Dr. Merrow was seated. Opposite was Temple. The Czech, Vacek, was absent, apparently unwell. A flu of the foreign variety, he had joked the week before. I stood at Vasey's place. The chairs had been rearranged since. But the echo remained. The scout said Vasey had offered the final toast. No one quite caught what he said. It was quiet, apparently. Laughter followed, but not from everyone. Merrow, I asked. She didn't laugh, he said. just raised her glass halfway and looked down. Lewis busied himself with the guest book in the porter's lodge. He has a tidy mind, just enough so that disorder clings to him like chalk dust. He noted that Vacek had signed in the night before Vasey died, though the guest house had no record of him returning that evening. Interesting, he said, in that careful way of his. I said, perhaps. There are moments when a case folds inward, when you cease to search forward and instead begin to read the palimpsest of gestures already made. In this case, it happened in the common room, not with a revelation, but with a name. An old woman, tightly wound in a cardigan and lipstick, was sorting through books on a donation trolley. I asked if she had known Vasey. She nodded, said they had once exchanged papers on restoration satire. He, she said, could be cruel. Not openly. He never shouted, but he had a gift for dismantling people in sentences of 10 words or fewer. I asked about the scholar he humiliated, the one I'd heard mentioned. There's a particular weight to letters that arrive too late. They press down, not with urgency, but with a kind of reluctant finality, a whisper from a voice already silenced. The envelope was plain, unsealed, resting beneath a dog-eared volume of Dryden essays in Vasey's study, as though it had slipped there of its own accord and fallen asleep. Addressed only to an M. No surname. No date. The handwriting, angular and too neat to be spontaneous, belonged to someone with something rehearsed. It contained a single line. The Latin was never wrong. The laughter was. I read it 3 times. Lewis read it once and blinked, as if expecting more to follow. I said nothing, though something about the phrasing disturbed me. There are sentences that seem to double back on themselves, revealing less the more you examine them. This was one of those. We walked back across the quad. It had started to drizzle again, that thin Oxford rain that doesn't fall so much as appear, as if summoned by doubt. I found myself thinking about an afternoon years ago, in the Sheldonian, when Vasey had corrected a lecturer mid-sentence during a public symposium. The man had misattributed a line of Juvenal. Vasey had coughed just once, then recited the original with surgical delicacy. I remember thinking it was less about accuracy and more about possession, as if Latin were something Vasey owned and we were all borrowing it on poor terms. The note, then, felt like a verdict. But from whom? That evening, I sat alone with a bottle of Glenfarclas and opened a battered file I hadn't meant to reopen, notes from a case 10 years old, a plagiarism scandal that had quietly dissolved into tenure, applications, and forgetfulness. A young academic, promising, arrogant, had lifted lines from Vasey's unpublished lecture notes. He was never formally named, but I remembered his defense. A misreading, he'd said. A misfiled source. His career had survived. Barely. And Vasey had declined to press it further. The laughter, perhaps, was in the restraint. A small note in the margins of one report. Something I'd not noticed before. A list of names, one crossed out. And beside it, the phrase, "No longer a threat. Too careful now." I traced the name. It was the same man I'd seen at high table earlier in the week, nodding over tea. The current Member of Parliament for South Oxfordshire, former student, former something else, perhaps. I wondered whether Vasey had kept the letter as a reminder, or whether it had arrived too recently to matter. Perhaps it was written in resentment, perhaps in love. The line about Latin stayed with me, echoing oddly beside the unfinished toast, the dead smile, the absence of poison. Later, Lewis knocked, holding a small plastic bag. A card, found in the bin near Vasey's study. Not torn, not burned, simply placed. On it, an early draft of the same phrase. The word laughter originally meant joke. Then crossed out, changed by hand. I asked him to leave me alone for a while. He did, without question. That night I stared at my bookshelf. The spines offered no help. Cicero, Plautus, Horace, all silent. I found myself fixating on a line from Satire 6, misquoted so often by students hoping to impress. Risu inepto res ineptior nulla est. There is nothing more foolish than foolish laughter. I lit a cigarette I didn't need and stared out at the street below. It was the sort of laugh that lasts too long, I thought, the kind that leaves everyone else quiet, and that, perhaps, had been the real crime. Not what Vasey said, but when he chose to say it, and who he thought would laugh. There's something oddly accusatory about college photographs, the way they fix faces into silence, into permanence. Time captured not in joy or memory, but in posture. I've never trusted them. The one I found was in the archives, behind the librarian's desk, kept in a manila envelope so brittle it seemed to resent being touched. 7 figures, 6 seated, 1 standing, black gowns, stiff smiles. The caption read, Viva Day, Trinity Term, 1971. 5 men, 1 woman, the 7th blurred, half-shadowed at the edge. Not quite cropped, not quite present. The woman was unmistakably younger, but recognizably Sarah Merrow. Her expression already composed into that same delicate unreadability she wore the other day. Lewis, who'd followed me into the archives like a reluctant schoolboy, tilted his head at the photograph. Said it looked ordinary enough. I said nothing. My attention was drawn not to the faces, but to the shadows behind them. The slight warping of light in the corner, the way the 7th figure stood just outside the arc of certainty. I asked the archivist, a man whose eyebrows had developed an autonomy of their own, if there was another copy. He hesitated, then brought out a yearbook. Fritterswide Record, 1971. Same image. But the 7th figure was gone. Cropped clean, airbrushed by absence. I asked who handled the edits. He muttered something about tradition, about preserving honor, about how photographs are curated, not merely kept. A curiously Orwellian phrase for a college so proud of its classical roots. I thanked him anyway. In the quad, the light had shifted. Spring in Oxford is never quite earnest. It pretends to arrive, then recedes again behind mist and memory. The cloistered walkways were damp, even under the sun. On one wall, not far from the old chapel door, hung a framed collection of past scholars. Vasey's name appeared 3 times, each entry a little more embellished. Once as a tutor, once as a fellow, once as a guest speaker at a centenary lecture on wit and wounding, satire and the scholar. I remembered that talk. He had quoted Swift. Then I corrected the quotation. A cleaner passed me in the hallway, pushing a silent trolley. She paused to adjust a frame that had hung slightly askew. A minor thing, the sort of thing most wouldn't notice, but I did. Behind the glass, the caption beneath the 1971 photograph had been typed, not handwritten like the others. The font was different too, slightly modern, out of place. Lewis asked if we were chasing ghosts. I said, perhaps. But ghosts in Oxford tend to leave forwarding addresses. That afternoon we visited the Bodleian, which had more complete archives. I found the original print in an exhibition binder, untouched since its submission. There, again, the 7th figure. Sharper this time. A man with his hands in his pockets, looking slightly away from the camera. The face was familiar. It took me a moment, but I saw it. A younger version of the MP I'd seen sipping tea 2 chapters ago, all smug discretion and parliamentary vowels. I traced my finger along the caption. His name wasn't listed, not even as absent. That was the quiet part, I thought, the part no one had said aloud. The joke, perhaps, was already beginning to form, or its shape, at least. On the way out, I passed a student staring too hard at her notes. She looked up briefly and smiled the kind of smile that apologizes before speaking. I didn't stop. Back in my flat that evening, I poured whiskey and unfolded the photograph again. The 7th figure, the ghost in the frame, seemed to stare past the others into something we still hadn't named. The crossword lay beside me. unfinished. 14 down, eraser of truth? 7. I didn't write the answer. I only thought it, and in the distance a bell sounded. Not for supper, for memory. I've always mistrusted laughter that arrives too early, the kind that precedes understanding or attempts to substitute for it. Vaisie's rooms, when I returned to them alone, still smelled of spiced paper and tired upholstery. The desk had been cleared formally by the college, his effects sorted into boxes, each labeled in a precise archivist's hand. But someone had missed a drawer. It wasn't locked, only stiff with disuse. Inside, beneath a folded sheet of music, Bach, if I recall, was a crossword torn from an old edition of the Times, perhaps a month old. Half completed, inked in a careful, narrow script I'd already come to recognize. 7 down was left blank. Final blow of jest? 9. The intersecting clues offered little. The rest of the puzzle, finished with ease, read like a man talking to himself in riddles. Lewis had wandered off to speak with the new bursar, a woman with a voice like breaking chalk and an allergy to adjectives. I remained behind. The light through the mullioned window fell at the wrong angle for thinking. Still I stared at the clue. Final blow of jest. Punchline. It came suddenly, and too easily. 9 letters. A perfect fit. I wrote it in, felt the weight of it. There was something accusatory in the word, as if Vaisie had left behind not an answer, but a confession disguised as amusement. Later, over tea with Dr. Temple, the classicist who had been most loquacious at the post-mortem, I asked if he remembered a particular lecture Vaisie had given on Juvenalian satire. He nodded slowly, stirred his tea anti-clockwise, said Vaisie had ended that talk with a line that lingered uncomfortably with several in the audience. Not because it was cruel, he said, but because no one could tell who it was for or against. He looked up, and for a moment his mask slipped. Said the thing about Vaisie wasn't that he enjoyed being right. It was that he enjoyed you being wrong. A quiet difference, but a meaningful one. That evening, walking back along Turl Street, I passed a small group of undergraduates laughing outside the tobacconist's. One wore a scarf twisted in the style Lewis always called aspirational. Their laughter was unrestrained, almost too bright against the wet pavements. One of them said something about that joke, and the others burst into renewed mirth. It meant nothing. And yet I paused. There is a frequency in laughter that only the guilty echo. I returned to the college one last time that night, dusk having folded itself quietly across the quad. In the senior common room, where shadows clung too tightly to the molding, I sat in Vaisie's former chair. Someone had removed the cushion. It was less comfortable than expected. From there, I could see the portraits. Rows of scholars, whose expressions had survived oil and time. Men and a few women, each looking out with the expression of someone misquoted in their own obituary. On a side table, left unnoticed by everyone, was a single sheet of A4, typed, anonymous, no header, just a quote. A jest's prosperity lies in the ear of him that hears it. Shakespeare, Love's Labour's Lost. The irony, I thought, was almost too tidy. I pocketed it. Outside, Lewis was waiting, shifting from foot to foot like someone trying not to guess the punchline of a riddle he suspects has no answer. We didn't speak until we reached the car. I asked if he ever thought about what makes a joke cruel. He said, "Only when no one's laughing," I said, "or when everyone is. Except one." He nodded, though I'm not sure he understood. The crossword remained folded in my coat pocket. The ink had begun to blur with the damp. Punchline, 9 letters. Too neat for grief, too late for forgiveness. The college was quieter than usual, that peculiar padded quiet, as if sound itself had grown too cautious to echo. Lewis met me outside the porter's lodge, his expression carrying the subdued triumph of someone with a lead that almost certainly wouldn't hold. He handed me a small plastic sleeve. Inside, a card, the same type as the one left on Vasey's desk, but this one bore only a smudge of red ink, faint but deliberate, across the lower corner. No text, no message, just the echo of a signature that had never been written. He said it had been found in the corridor waste bin outside the guest rooms, likely thrown away in haste. The ink, forensics confirmed, matched a rare European brand, Terezine Scarlet No. 5, sold primarily in Prague and discontinued in 1984. The pen that was used would be equally obscure, collectible only to those with the kind of personality that enjoys correcting misprints in footnotes. I had known one such man. Thomas Vacek, visiting scholar, Czech, humorist, at least by his own insistence. His lectures, by all accounts, were amusing in the way philosophy students find Nietzsche funny. Through discomfort and delay, he had not returned to the college since Vasey's death. Claimed flu, or grief, or possibly both. Lewis suspected him. The ink, the nationality, the argument over Latin prosody. All the boxes, as they say, were ticked. I asked Lewis if he'd laughed at anything Vacek had said. He frowned. Said no, not once. I made a note of that. We visited Vacek's lodgings near Magdalene Street, a top-floor flat overlooking the kind of chimney-strewn skyline that makes you feel both intelligent and ill. The flat was sparse. A kettle, unopened biscuits, and a stack of outdated satirical journals in Czech. Vacek himself greeted us in a dressing gown and with the kind of weary civility that Europeans reserve for bureaucracy and police. He offered us mint tea. We declined. His alibi, it turned out, was immaculately dull. He had been in Bath during the evening in Tardus. Question, giving a lecture on absurdist philosophy to a half-empty room of reluctant attendees. There were photos, a recording, a train ticket, stamped, even the time-stamped indignity of a Sainsbury's receipt, elderflower tonic and paracetamol. I almost pitied him, but something in the way he held his teacup, thumb extended like a comma, suggested he was holding back a clause. I asked him if he liked Vasey. He said yes, then no. Then yes again, but not in the same way. He said Vasey had once rewritten a joke of his and made it cruel. The audience had laughed, and Vacek had smiled because there was nothing else to do. He said it was a strange thing, to have someone take your timing, your rhythm, and turn it against you. He called it surgical theft. I said I knew the feeling. When we left, Lewis asked if I believed him. I said yes, which meant number, or possibly both. That evening, I returned to my crossword, an older one I'd been keeping in the drawer since last spring. 18 across. Deliberate misdirection. 6, 8. The answer. Red herring. 2 words. Obvious, really. And yet it sat unfinished until that moment. I inked it in. Slowly. The next day, the college confirmed that the ink found on the card, the red ink, had also been used in a handwritten correction in one of the archived yearbooks. The 1971 entry. The same one that had mysteriously lost its 7th figure. The correction read simply, removed for clarity. I stared at the phrase for longer than I should have. Clarity, I thought, is rarely the reason something disappears. Not here, not in Oxford, and certainly not from memory. It happened, as most of the meaningful things in my life seem to. Not with a discovery, but with a mistake. The sort of mistake most would let slip past, unremarked, like a dropped coin on a noisy pavement. But Oxford, as I've often said, is built upon mistakes spoken confidently. The quote arrived in the middle of a conversation I wasn't entirely invested in. Temple was holding court in the common room again, recounting, for the benefit of 2 American postgraduate students and a visibly withering Merrow, an anecdote involving Wilde, absinthe, and the wrong side of the high street. It was a pleasant fabrication. But the punchline, the quote, caught me off guard. He said, "We are all in the gutter, But some of us are looking at the ceiling, not the stars. It was deliberate, and I knew it. Later, I asked Temple about the quote. He blinked slowly, sipped at his coffee, which, despite being poured from a cafetiere of admirable polish, had the unmistakable aroma of regret. He said he always preferred his version. Those stars these days were out of reach. But ceiling, now that was manageable. It was a line too careful to be accidental, too ironic to be harmless. I left shortly after. Merrow caught my sleeve in the hallway and asked if I was still chasing ghosts. I said no, just waiting for one to speak. That afternoon, I found myself at the Radcliffe camera, not reading, but pretending to. The pages of the Oxford Book of Quotations held little that hadn't been wielded at one time or another by someone trying to win an argument or seduce an undergrad. I wasn't looking for the original quote. I knew it. I was looking for something that had been stolen, reshaped, a borrowed line now misaligned. Something false, disguised as literary wisdom. In the back of the index, the section rarely used, I found a reference to an obscure footnote in Wilde's correspondence. A letter to Bosie, never sent. In it, Wilde writes, "The stars no longer comfort me. Their light is too far, and the ceiling is cracked with damp." There it was. A joke that wasn't a joke. A ceiling substituted for longing. It reminded me of something Merrow had said weeks before when she first mentioned Vesey's lectures. That his greatest power wasn't the ability to persuade, but to reframe. He didn't destroy arguments. He rewrote their premises until no one was sure what they'd meant to say. Back at the college, I requested access to Vesey's personal annotations, a set of lecture notes he kept locked in the upper drawer of his filing cabinet. I'd seen them referenced in the cataloging summary, unpublished, marked in margin. The pages were brittle, written in fountain ink, but they hummed with a precision I'd come to recognize. On one, beside a passage on verbal irony and its discontents, was a line in red: misquote to wound, correct to humiliate, invent to erase. 3 sentences. Not in quotes, not footnoted, not attributed. Just there, as though they had been waiting. The following morning, Lewis handed me a folder containing student essays from Vesey's final year of formal teaching. One submitted under a pseudonym, not unusual apparently, for scholars who feared reputation more than obscurity, quoted Wilde's gutter line incorrectly. Ceiling, not stars. I cross-referenced the handwriting from the exam booklet with a note I'd received from the MP's office earlier that week, an RSVP declining an invitation to the memorial lecture. The loops matched. So did the flourish on the capital T. It was a long shot, I told myself. But I don't believe in coincidence. Not here. Not with these people. Not with Vesey. He hadn't just hurt someone. He'd allowed them to plagiarize, protected them by never revealing it. He'd made the joke, the whole thing, his own. And in doing so, had trapped them in a version of their own voice they could never explain. The stars had been replaced. The ceiling, cracked or otherwise, was all that remained. That evening, I didn't go home. I sat outside the Bodleian, watching the rain trace old paths down the stone. Students passed. Some ran. One stopped to light a cigarette beneath the arch. I thought of Wilde again, and ceilings, and how quiet the sky can become when no one believes in stars anymore. I stayed until the bells rang for matins. Alone, though not unaccompanied. There are epigrams that bleed. This one simply vanished. It was the sort of dinner that gets written into college annals without ever being recorded. A few port glasses, a cluster of reluctant anecdotes, the scent of overcooked pigeon beneath varnished portraits. Nothing on the surface that would trouble a conscience, and yet something in the air had remained. The residue of a joke unshared. They'd asked me to attend the memorial supper. Not officially, of course. The college has a delicate relationship with scandal, particularly when it involves one of their own. But the invitation arrived all the same. Gilt lettering on ivory card, too stiff for sincerity, in remembrance of Dr. Miles Vasey. Lewis declined, said he had paperwork. I suspected he disliked the food, so I went alone. The hall at St. Friddenwide's was always too tall for comfort, its stone ceiling stretching upward like a rebuke. Candles flickered just enough to cast shadows where expressions might have been. The high table sat 12. Familiar faces. Temple, unsmiling. Merrow, unreadable. The MP, who'd arrived late, nodded politely to no one in particular. I took my seat where Vasey once had, third from the right, beneath the portrait of a man who'd hanged himself over an administrative decision in 1863. The food was forgettable, the wine was not. Conversation flitted, literary, polite, and almost entirely without meaning. An air of evasion hung around the table like smoke. Every anecdote is carefully chosen. No one said what they remembered, only what was safe to say they remembered. It was Merrow who raised her glass first, a quiet clearing of the throat, then to Miles, for his wit, which never spared us, and his memory, which surely won't either. No laughter, just the sound of glasses raised, some halfway, a few, not at all. Then came the toast. Temple, who had not spoken since the soup, cleared his throat and quoted a line. One I recognized. The man who jokes last leaves no room for answers. Said it as if it were Vasey's favorite. But it wasn't. It was his own. I'd heard him say it once at a staff meeting, years ago, when someone challenged his reading of Juvenal. It was then I saw the glance. Merrow across the table, her eyes flicking, not to Temple, but to the MP. A brief tilt of the head, not accusatory, almost weary, as though to say, you see, even now they're still rewriting the past. After dinner, coffee was served in the common room, that perfumed cave of polished oak and low murmurs. I remained at the back, near the window, and watched the others in reflection. The MP joined me, casually. Said he'd enjoyed the evening, that Oxford still smelled the same. I asked if he remembered Vasey's last toast. He hesitated. Said he didn't. Said he must have been distracted. But I remembered. 3 nights before Vasey died, in this very room, he had raised his glass and spoken a line that made no one laugh. A line I hadn't understood then. Not fully. You never knew, did you? That was it. No preamble. No smile. Just that. Tonight someone had tried to overwrite it, replace it with something digestible. That was the toast replayed. Not a memory, but a substitution. Later, walking home beneath the cloisters, I passed the old bench where Vasey had once marked essays on a clipboard in spring sun. A detail came to me. Not a fact, a gesture. That was when he'd raised his glass all those nights ago. He hadn't looked at anyone. Not Temple, not Merrow, not the MP. He'd looked down, as if the toast wasn't for them at all, but for himself. And I thought perhaps the joke had always been private, and he'd been waiting to share it with someone who wouldn't laugh. The final clue, when it arrived, did not arrive at all. It was there already. In the will, tucked neatly beside the brass paperweight on Vasey's desk, marked Addendum, Private Codicil. No solicitor's stamp, no legalese, no evident ambition for legacy. Just a clause. And a name. To Miss Sarah Merrow, he had left a blank envelope. Inside it, a single slip of paper bearing 5 words. He finally got it. There were no further instructions. No explanation, no sum of money, no books, no dusty chess set or favored edition of Horace. Only the phrase. Lewis read it aloud, slowly, with that faint furrow of concentration he always wore when he suspected meaning might be hiding beneath the surface. He asked if it was a reference. I said it was a punchline. I visited Merrow later that day. The porter said she'd already collected the envelope. I found her in her office, alone, the blinds drawn halfway, the desk cluttered with papers whose order she clearly understood. She didn't rise when I entered, only motioned toward the opposite chair, which creaked in protest beneath me. She placed the note between us. Said nothing. I asked her how long she'd known he would leave it. She looked away, not evasively, but with a kind of practiced restraint, as if she'd already answered the question in some other conversation, years ago, with herself. She said it wasn't forgiveness, nor was it confession. It was the closest he could come to either, and far too late for both. I asked what he'd finally understood. She smiled, not mockingly, almost tenderly. That it had never been a joke, she said. Not really. That was what he'd taken from her. The moment, the lecture, the rising confidence of a younger woman daring to speak in a room of men who'd learned to nod without listening. Hadn't been cleverness. It had been theft, masked in amusement, a public misquotation, a deliberate substitution of her final point with a Wildine flourish that wasn't hers. The laughter had drowned everything else. She said she had written him a note once, years later. Anonymous. No threats, just the corrected version of her argument, typed and unsigned. He never acknowledged it. But in one of his footnotes, the following term, there it was, her phrasing, almost verbatim, attributed to an unnamed contributor. We sat in silence for a while after that, the kind of silence you don't interrupt. There are few people in Oxford who carry their grief with precision. She was one of them. On the way out, I paused in the stairwell. The banister was worn smooth from decades of unthinking hands. It occurred to me that Vesey, in his final days, had begun to unwrite himself. The revisions in his notes, the sudden return to unfinished lectures, the gathering of old student papers. He had not been composing, he had been erasing. The joke, the unspoken one, was not something he had told. It was something he had become. That night I walked through Jericho. The pubs were half full, the air sour with beer and beginning rain. I stopped outside the King's Arms, stared through the glass. The same crossword was pinned behind the bar, a gimmick for patrons to complete between pints and regrets. 18 across, still unfinished. Gesture of wit's departure, 9. The same clue I'd seen before, the same word I'd written elsewhere. Punchline. I wrote it in again. A useless act, satisfying only in its repetition. Lewis called while I was unlocking my flat. Said the MP had formally withdrawn from the lecture series. No reason given. A letter had arrived. Brief, courteous, almost relieved. I didn't respond. I stared at the envelope on my own table. Mine, unopened. No name, no hand I recognized. Inside, blank. A joke without its build-up. Or perhaps the punchline had always been silence. Later, I poured myself a whiskey and turned on the radio. An old violin piece was playing. Bach, I think. One of the ones that keeps repeating itself just differently enough to feel new. Outside, the city exhaled. And I thought, not for the first time, that some people die waiting for the laughter, and others die because it finally came. There's something about a final clue that resists being final. It doesn't announce itself, doesn't declare the mystery solved. It lingers just beneath the surface of understanding, like the faint trace of ink on paper that's been blotted once too quickly. I found mine at the very end, not in the evidence room or the archives, but in the pub where it all began. The same half-lit table near the back of the King's Arms, the same folded crossword left beneath a ring of stale beer. And beside it, tucked neatly under the glass salt shaker, was the coaster. Not the original. That had long since been logged, bagged, and filed under an incident number that would mean nothing to anyone but Lewis. No, this one was fresh. Same size. Same dull beige card. But this time, someone had written on it in a sharper, more recent hand. Still neat, but more certain. Only the ink remembers. I sat there for a long while. Lewis joined me later, carrying 2 pints and the look of a man who wasn't sure whether to speak. He asked if it meant anything. I said it might. It might mean that someone had been here again, recently. That they wanted to be seen, or half seen. That the joke, if that's what it ever was, had been shared once more, or returned to sender. The problem with meaning, I told him, is that it grows heavier the longer you carry it. He asked about Merrow. I said she wouldn't be answering any more questions. Not because she couldn't. She could, exquisitely. But because she had no reason to. Her silence now carried more weight than any confession. It was then I noticed the bar mat beneath the crossword had bled slightly at one edge. A drop of water or beer, perhaps. But the ink, the final letter in the final answer, had run. Just slightly. One corner of the E in punchline had blurred outward. Barely noticeable. Except to someone who spent his life noticing what others did not. I asked the barman if the crossword was ever changed. He looked up, shrugged, and said people liked it the way it was. It gave the regulars something to argue about, and no one ever agreed on how it should end. That seemed right. Back at my flat, I took out Vasey's notebook, the one recovered from his study drawer. Half full. Mostly lecture fragments, a few scribbled diagrams, and at the back, written in a faded red ink I now recognized too well, were 4 lines of poetry. Unattributed, possibly his own. The joke begins before the line, where laughter waits without a face. It's never said, but always heard, a silence written into place. I read them again, then a 3rd time. It was all there, the misquotation, the altered toast, the anonymous notes, the vanished student in the photograph, even the replacement of the ceiling for stars. Each is a substitution, not to deceive, but to delay recognition. Vasey had built his life around redirection, irony as insulation, a fortress of footnotes and literary riddles, and someone finally had answered him in kind. Merrow hadn't killed him. I don't believe anyone did. His heart had simply stopped. Quietly, efficiently, without ceremony. But the message left behind, the card on his desk, the ink, the tone, that had been her parting gift. A last act of authorship. Not revenge, not justice, but the rewriting of the final line. Lewis said something about closure. I told him not everything needs to be closed. Some doors are meant to stay ajar. Memory prefers it that way. I watched the rain begin again, tapping at the window as if trying to be let in. In the quiet, I finished my own crossword. 22 down. Word without echo. 8. I paused before filling it in. It wasn't a punchline, that much was certain. I wrote afterword, and beneath it, lightly, in pencil, so it could be erased. I added one more word. Unspoken. Then I turned off the light and listened for the laughter. It didn't come, but neither did silence.